Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for checking out this video. It is my great pleasure today to welcome and to get to spend some time chatting with my PhD mentor, my PhD mentor and beekeeping mentor, Professor Tom Seeley, emeritus professor at Cornell University and author of a brand new and really fun, really exciting book on honeybee behavior. And so I've asked Tom, and he's very graciously agreed to come onto the Betterbee YouTube channel so that we can just have a little chat about where this book came from and why he wrote it and why everybody should go and buy it and read it and have a wonderful time learning about bees. So thank you, Tom, and welcome.
I'm honored to be here, David. So, yeah, I'm happy to talk about this book. Been a labor of love, and I hope it will be very valuable and for beekeepers as well.
Excellent. Well, I think I'm going to sort of open this interview by just telling a brief story, and this is maybe some context that I want to offer to folks who are listening to this, maybe folks who haven't read any of your books. And I don't even know if you're aware of this, but I actually became a scientist, a honeybee scientist, or even just a scientist in general, because of your writing. Because I was taking an animal behavior class with Phil Starks, one of your former mentees at Tufts University, where I was an undergraduate student, and I was taking this class, and he assigned one of your papers, and I read it, and I think I was a senior or a junior at the time. I'd read all sorts of scientific papers in my different classes, but I'd never read one that felt fun. It felt like a story. It felt like I was being told clearly what you had done and why you had done it and what you had learned by doing the research. And I realized that science doesn't have to be stuffy and boring. It's just that most scientists are terrible writers. So that opened my mind to the idea that, maybe there could be some fun, exciting thinking going on in science. And that sort of veered me out of the pre-medical track I was on. And it's what led me to being the scientist that I am today. So I just want to thank you for your writing, and I'm so glad that the scientists who get to read your writing, our scientific colleagues, can read your published academic papers, but that you also take the time and put in all of this effort to produce these books that are not necessarily meant for scientists. They're meant for people who don't have that training, because you can write so clearly, you can explain all of the background that they need. They don't have to have an advanced degree just to understand what you're talking about.
Yeah, I really we work hard to learn these things about the bees. I don't want these discoveries to be hidden away in the scientific journals. I want
Right.
them accessible to the people who are probably the most interested in honeybees, even more than the scientists, i.e., devoted beekeepers.
And actually, throughout the book, for the sections of it that I've had the privilege of getting to read here before the launch actually happens, you make that very clear that sometimes you would make a discovery, but then realize partway through that you had sort of remade the discovery. Someone had figured out at least a key clue in the journey, and then they'd maybe published about it in some obscure journal, and no one had ever done anything since. And then you pick up the thread and pick up the trail and then continue on to try to figure out exactly what these bees are doing.
Yeah, that's right. And that's how it often works. There's been hmm, people have seen something, have talked a little, written about it a little bit, maybe in one of the bee journals, um, and uh, but didn't go real deeply into it. And we can talk about some examples of some of the signals that they make, somehow they control their water collection, how they collect the resin or make the propolis. Those are things um, that can catch your eye as a beekeeper while you're working the bees. You see bees running in with those glistening loads of resin on their legs. It catches your attention and piques your curiosity.
And maybe what I should do now is before we get into any of these stories, is just say clearly to everyone who's watching, the title of the book is Piping Hot Bees and Boisterous Buzz Runners. And what it really is, I really like the structure that you've used. Each chapter is very bite-sized. It is one particular honeybee behavior, some amazing discovery, some mystery that was solved, usually that you solved. But it's some fascinating individual bee behavior that you're going to highlight, that you fully explain, what that behavior is, what initially caught your attention or science's attention or beekeepers' attention, and then how we were able to elucidate what those behaviors really mean.
Mhm. Yeah, that's right. It's it's behavior by behavior, and the stories are told um, in pretty much chronological order. So if you if you need to understand something in a particular chapter that depends on a previous chapter, there it is. It's you if you've looked at it from the beginning, then you'll understand how okay how this behavior builds on, or story builds on a previous story. For
Right.
example, the story of what the natural nests are like, the bee tree nests are like, that set the stage for the addressing experimentally the question, what do the bees seek in a home site? Um, and so those are two separate chapters, but they build they work very well together, I
Mhm.
think.
In much the same way that as scientists, we really, when we write our papers, we very narrowly limit ourselves to just one question. We get an answer to that question, but then we hope that that answer is going to be something we build on when we publish the next paper and the next paper. And your career has very much followed that same trajectory, is that you answer one question to your complete satisfaction, and that kind of lets you move on to the next question that flows from it.
Yeah, that's right.
I like that you describe these as stories, that this really is storytelling when you're talking about your research. Why do you think it is that other science writing isn't like yours? Why did I have to read all of those papers before I finally found your writing and realized that there was something quite different from the way other scientists write about their work?
I don't think they have, I think most scientists write it, present their work in a different way because they don't have a good model. And I learned this storytelling even within a scientific paper from a Swiss scientist named Rudiger Weiner. He studies how ants that live in the desert navigate, find their way out of their nests, go across this featureless landscape, and still find their way right back to the nest entrance. And I saw that and I said, I'm going to learn how to do. I'm going to learn how to write my scientific papers that way. So that I can't claim that I invented it, but it really once I saw that, I realized I wanted to do that, and then I stuck with it. And it, yeah, it, I'm glad. Thank you for pointing out that that's an unusual way of writing a scientific paper, but it's very. I think it works well.
Well, I certainly agree, and I'm a poorer writer than you, but I try to emulate your style as well because it's just so much. It's more fun to write, and it's a heck of a lot more fun to read. And so I think the maybe we should get into a little bit of the meat of this and let's talk about some bee behavior instead of scientific writing. So all of the subtitle of the book is 20 Mysteries of Honeybee Behavior Solved. I guess one question that I'll ask is, of all of these mysteries of bee behavior, what was the most surprising to you when you cracked the code or figured out what it was that was going on? Which of these do you think was the biggest or one of the biggest shocks to you as a researcher?
Well, one was there's a there's yeah there's several that strike me as had a real surprise element to them. Um, One was just how the signal from the queen presence signal, which is it's a chemical signal. I was always wondered how that got around to all the nurse bees. And I had set up an observation hive and I had labeled some bees in there so I could track individuals. And I saw there a remarkable thing that if one of those bees that's in the queen's court gets a lot of contact with the queen, well, when she breaks off, she starts walking pretty quickly around inside the nest. And other bees are focused. They're sensing that they're giving her this what I call a messenger bee their attention as they
Mhm.
sniff her antennae. That was a pretty cool thing. That was a pretty nice insight or discovery to
Mhm.
make, or starting of the discovery. Another one was in when I studied swarms. Well, actually, no, actually, in the foraging, in the context of foraging, I would see, as others had before me, that sometimes you've trained bees out to collect um, a sugar solution from a feeder. That sometimes on some days the bees will, if you're giving them really good food, some days they come back and they do a waggle dance, which is what we all know about and hear about. But some days they come back and they don't do a waggle dance. Instead, they look like they've been hit with pesticide or something because they walk around very jerky sort of, I call it behavior. I've called it the tremble dance. Um, and I saw that for years and was puzzled by it. And then finally, in one context, I realized, oh, that's what it is. That bee's having trouble getting unloaded. And she's making a signal to call for more of the nectar bees to function as nectar receivers. That was a really sweet one. And that was particularly sweet because it even puzzled Carl von Frisch. He saw it in the
Right.
19 teens. He called it der Zittertanz, that's jitter dance. And he said, you know, he told his student, who told me, his student Martin Lindauer, Carl Frisch told his student Martin Lindauer, who told me this story. He said, Carl Frisch told him, Martin Lindauer, he said, if anybody ever figures out what that Zittertanz, this tremble dance is, I'll give him a medal. But unfortunately, I didn't figure it out until Carl von Frisch had died after he died. And so that would
And
have been a really
the
sweet
beauty
thing.
of that discovery in particular is that it really is, it's something that you'd noticed, but it isn't even something that you set out to study. It's that the way you discovered it was that you were manipulating the nectar collectors and the food storage bees, and only in that manipulation related to another project did you suddenly realize that you were able to create that dance and start to figure out what it was all about.
Yeah, that's right. So it's a good example of how often the most fresh or revealing discoveries are made unintentionally because you're seeing something you weren't actually looking for, and then you see it and then you follow it.
Mhm.
So,
On the other side, were there any of the discoveries you talk about in the book that weren't really surprises? Things that you were working through, that you were working on, but that you pretty much felt like you understood it before you started, or was there always a sense of mystery as you worked?
probably one example of which where the investigation was done, and it was a difficult investigation, but we sort of knew how it worked, is the flight control of swarms. Once a swarm is launched into flight, only a few percent of the bees where the swarm should fly to. And they are guiding, they're providing flight guidance. Those are the nest site scouts that have visited the new home site. And people had seen, looking up into a cloud of a swarm, an airborne swarm, you can see bees shooting through it at high speed, pointing in the direction that the swarm is going to move to. And they tend to be at the top of the cloud of the bees. They're pretty conspicuous. So people thought that was what was going on. Um, uh, but it wasn't until we did some experiments where we could actually video record it with high-speed videography and analyze the pattern of movements where we could really see that these bees that are pointing the way, they come to the back of the swarm cloud and then they accelerate over the top of the swarm and make a very conspicuous pointing process to steer the swarm to the right flight direction. That was pretty. That was one where we sort of knew what we do. We sort of understood what the bees were doing, but didn't didn't really couldn't say for sure that was it was is what we were seeing was actually correct and
Right. And the research was both, it sort of gave a conclusive answer to whether or not people's intuition was right, and it also wound up revealing new things. It's not just that they're sort of shooting through the swarm, it's that they're at the top of the swarm. So we learn things by doing that thorough study as well.
yeah.
Uh, so much of the book, and what I find really interesting about it is unlike many other books that you read, so much of this book is about individual bees. We've talked about this idea of storytelling, and in good storytelling, you've got to have characters, and a lot of the characters in many of your chapters are individual honeybees. Bees like yellow thorax or red thorax. you're describing an individual bee who you've painted a dot on, and then you walk us through your experience of watching her behavior and then making some groundbreaking discovery. Why did you choose to write from this perspective? Why is this book so many stories about individual worker bee behaviors?
Um, Great question, David, and it goes right at the heart of the way I do my research. I like to start with some colony level phenomenon, like a swarm emerges from its nest or a swarm um, flies out, um, flies to its new home site. But that's just that's one level of description. But I like to understand how that colony level phenomenon is produced by the actions and interactions of individual worker bees. And so that's why I have to drop down to the level of the individual. And this is again what Carl Frisch did many years ago. Beekeepers had known for a long time that if the if there's a nectar dearth on and a bit of comb is left out, one bee will find it eventually, and then there's a mob of bees shortly thereafter. And nobody knew quite how that worked, and that until Carvin Frisch set that scenario up with bees coming observation hive, and he then labeled the first bee to find the comb, the good food, and then he was able to watch what she did in the hive. And he said it was the most far reaching observation of his life to see the little bee with a red dot on her back come in and do this. He called it a dance right from the beginning. But it was interesting. It took him, he thought it was just an arousal signal. He didn't even dare contemplate, well, he did contemplate it, but he thought it was too far-fetched that the bee would provide direction and distance information. He just thought it was a signal that there's somewhere outside the hive there's really good food now. And it wasn't until uh, about 20 years later that he made the discovery that they could, when they do this arousal dance signal, it's distance and direction information. Yeah.
Uh, Do you
Answer to
think
your
that
question.
do you think that other scientists who bee scientists who have tended to focus on apiary level questions or colony level questions, um, do you think that they're going about things the wrong way, or do you think that you just have a perspective and they have another perspective? Why is it that you think that your perspective has been so fruitful? Do you think it is that you're willing to get down and ask an individual bee a question where other folks are just looking at, something on the hive level?
I think the two approaches are complementary and they're both very, very useful. Um, if I, and I've done both. For example, one and wanted to know how a colony controls the amount of drone comb it has. I did colony level experiments where I gave them different treatments, whether the existing drone comb could be touched by the bees or whether they could only smell the drone comb. So that approach is also completely valid. Um, Often, however, if you really want to understand some colony level phenomenon, it, it it is going to be a product of what the individual bees do, just as in our own bodies. What our bodies do are a function of what the cells in our bodies do. And so, yeah, the two are different levels of analysis, different levels of the system organization. I have found it I find it really pleasing to follow individual worker bees because then it's a little bit like watching people. um, that's then it becomes a very familiar observation process to us.
Hmm.
We watch other individuals. We don't generally watch crowds of people, but we do watch other individuals. So I
Hmm.
think our brains are pretty wired up to look at behavior at that level.
And as a beekeeper, think that I have benefited hugely from having followed your example, which is that very often, at least while I was in the lab, you would set up an observation hive that you would just keep tabs on over the course of the winter. And so I've followed that same suit. I always set up an observation hive in fall, and I have individual bees that I can go and talk to and look at and ask questions about. And getting to watch the way that they make their way through the winter gives me some insights into what my bees out in the apiaries are doing. So I think that this perspective is really valuable to beekeepers, not just to scientists, but really just to beekeepers ourselves, to remember that yes, the colonies are a superorganism and they do all of this great stuff, but that superorganism is made up of individual bees, and those individual bees have their own fascinating little lives.
Oh yeah. Yeah. The yes, the worker bee is very much a marvelous creature. It's it's and why is that? It's because it's much like us, David. They are highly social creatures. And our the complexity of our minds and our abilities to communicate and do build beautiful buildings and things like that, those are all so those are all skills that the people, humans possess because they've it's worked well for their group, their
Mhm.
social group. Um, yeah, it's that's a yeah, yeah.
So one thing I do want to mention about the book, just to remind people that they're supposed to be buying the book after they watch this video, is I do want to really praise the figures that you've used throughout it. And you know this is something that's true of your scientific papers, of the other books of yours that I've read. You use a beautiful blend of photographs, of diagrams and illustrations, of anatomical drawings of the bees, of graphs, but the graphs aren't scary. If you're not a scientist, you can still interpret a graph when you put it in because you make it very clear what it's trying to show you. It's not jumbled or confusing. Um, and I really think that's remarkable. It's often the case that I'll look at a science book and I'll read a graph or I'll see a figure and I'm more confused than when I started. But I think that you use these illustrations to really bring a huge amount of clarity to what you're talking about. So, do you think that a picture is worth 1,000 words? Is that your philosophy? Do you write the books only when you don't have enough photos and diagrams to illustrate the point?
Um, no, for me, the diagrams, the visuals work hand in hand with the writing.
Mm.
And and you're right. They're not most of these diagrams are not very complicated because I want them to be easily understood. With the new software, you can make graphs that are just almost impenetrably complicated. Uh, and because I'm not sure why that's happened because it's almost like authors of papers forget that they actually are trying to show something clearly to the reader. So yeah, these are pretty simple, but I also I always what I do is if I see a really good figure, I store it away. I think that person did a really nice job. And one example, I don't know if it'll show up here, but it's these nice diagrams made by the German gentleman Martin Lindauer, where he depicted in such a beautifully visual way of just these arrows pointing off of a circle, where the circle represents the swarm and the arrows point to the different home sites. It was a beautiful graphical way of illustrating a lot of information.
It's so
And
elegant. You use very little ink and you get quite a lot of information out of each scrap of it.
you don't even have to, you can just look at it and you know what it's telling you. You
Right.
don't have to study.
No, no caption necessary.
Yeah.
And I also really like the photographs throughout the book. You've got a lot of photographs where you say, the chapter goes on to explain what sort of a test you were doing. We set up this observation hive, or we put out this feeder, and we went out to this field, and we did this thing. But then there's a photograph of the student, knee deep in mud, sitting in the field, marking the bees as they go. Or there's an illustration of the student, craning her neck at the observation hive. And I think it's a really transparent way of telling people how you did your science. You're saying, here's a photo of us doing the experiment, and this is what we saw, and this is what the observation hive was made of, and you know, I think that this is what the hairstyles that we all had during during the research. but I think it really shows very clearly to the readers again, it all goes to contribute to the clarity of the story you're telling about each of these amazing bee behaviors.
Thank you, David. Because I said I guess I'd have to say I had two target audiences for writing this book. One was first and foremost is beekeepers, because
Hmm.
those are the people that are really interested in bees. But there's another target audience, much smaller, and that is undergraduate students or even high school students that are studying biology. And I, I wanted them to enjoy what I enjoyed. I was turned on, you might say, by a little book written by Martin Lindauer, the German scientist mentor of mine, who it's called Communication Among Social Bees. It just has five chapters, and each chapter is a story, like each of these chapters in my book is a story of a line of study that he did. And anybody can read these stories, I think. And um, I sure did as a high school student, and I wasn't, very scientifically very astute or anything like that at that time. So yeah, that's why I put in the pictures too. Now we have the luxury of putting in beautiful color photographs of bees and setups and things like that. Yeah,
And you do also throughout you give the names of the various people who worked with you, right? It's a great recollection of all of the many collaborators and mentees and students that you've worked with, and it's really interesting that you'll sometimes mention someone, and the astute reader will go, oh, Dave Tarpey, he's now a professor. A lot of these people have gone on to great success, but you also will mention undergraduate students who were there, they did great work in the lab, and then they've gone off and done other things with their lives. They aren't bee scientists, but you make it very clear that you didn't do all of this alone, but that you team up with individual people, and that you make these discoveries together, and then they go off wherever they go. But it's very much sort of this cast of characters that have come through your lab over the years.
I
Um,
don't know. I don't know if it's 60 or 70 or whatever, but yes, every
mhm,
summer to do most of these experiments, it required a small team of people,
mhm,
and one person, for example, to be at the observation hive, another at a feeder or
mhm,
feeders if there are multiple feeders, or in the swarm studies, one person's at the swarm, the other's at the nest box or something like that.
mhm,
And um, yeah, and so in the introduction to the preface, yeah, there's a long list of helpers.
mhm,
One thing that was I felt extremely lucky in my career, David, in having access to two very special study sites. One was an island off the coast of Maine where the swarm, where swarms had no good nest sites.
right.
So
Real
they had to,
crummy bee habitat.
yeah, so they had to go to my experimental nest boxes. And that allowed me to analyze the decision-making process. And the other stroke of good fortune was finding a place in northern New York State in the Adirondack State Park where there are virtually no flowers most of the summer.
Mhm,
So take a colony of bees up there, and they're desperate, and they really are eager to come to these artificial food sources.
mhm,
And so I was, again, got control over what their options were, and I could watch the
mhm,
decision-making process, how they get organized in the morning,
mhm.
things like that. Go to
You like to
sleep.
be the only game in town, basically.
When you do an experiment, as you know, you want to be able to create the variables. You don't want nature changing
Mhm,
the changing things, man. Goodness knows we don't have complete control. A rainstorm can come along, or you get a spell of cold weather, and you have to work with the weather. That's always out of control. But
right.
in terms of things that the bees are when the bees are active in those locations, be it the nest site gets on the Appledore Island, or the nectar or water collectors up at the Cranberry Lake Biostation. Yeah, we had good control there.
As a bee behaviorist, something that always strikes me that I've always sort of enjoyed and found fascinating is that we study honeybees. We study these animals that humans have been closely focused on, that people have been making their livings from for thousands of years. And it's amazing to me that, we have Aristotle writing about honeybees, but when he does it, he writes about things that are commonplace to beekeepers, the important fundamental behaviors of keeping our bees. But he also, he waxes poetic about the king bees. And it took humans thousands of years for someone to look closely and say, hey, these king bees are laying an awful lot of eggs. We may want to think about renaming them. So it's just amazing that humanity spends so much time with these bees that we get so close to understanding something, but we don't quite get it until there's that last scientific leap. There's that last step. We talk about bees recruiting each other to food. We talk about, bees gyrating around in the hive, but it takes Carl von Frisch to say, wait a second, they're using a waggle dance language, and this is how it works, and now I've decoded it. And so many of the stories you tell really have that same quality. It's something that, wouldn't have been an astonishing behavior to beekeepers, but we didn't really have an explanation until you did this research and you made these breakthroughs. Is there any rhyme or reason to how we make those breakthroughs, those leaps of discovery?
Yeah, usually it's, well, in my experience, it's usually you're looking at one thing, you're doing an experiment, or you're looking for one thing, and then you notice something on the side, or the bees show you that something that you aren't expecting, but it but you can but you suddenly see the situation. You know something about what the condition for that bee was that caused her to do this. Let me
Hmm.
give you an example. That what I've said is pretty murky. And a good example is the shaking signal. It's that signal that every beekeeper probably has seen, where one worker bee goes over, grabs another bee with her forelegs, and shakes the other bee. And people had seen that for a lot of many times, but it wasn't until a young woman in Scotland, northern Scotland, set up an observation hive, and she wasn't looking for the shaking signal. She was looking at how a colony prepares to swarm. And she carefully and diligently noted how often the queen was shaken, starting several weeks before the swarm departed. And she saw that that queen was being shaken more and more and more and more and more, and so she wasn't laying eggs, and the queen was moving around a lot, and it crescendos, that level of shaking of the queen and her mobility crescendos with the departure of the swarm. So that's the kind of thing that, again, it's based on following an individual. In that case, it was easy. It was the queen to follow and see who was shaking her, and but then recording it systematically, having noticed it, then observing it closely.
Right. Well, right. That's the difference between science and screwing around, is that in science you take notes. But
Yeah,
that
yeah,
maybe at heart what it is that being willing and putting the time into doing that very close observation, but then maintaining curiosity, letting yourself be distracted by some fascinating little thing you see on the side, and starting to notice, I was here to study this, but now I'm getting more interested in that, so maybe we'll turn our attention that way.
yeah. It's also that example I just gave also illustrates that the human being has to be have had the good fortune to be in a situation where they can actually pay close attention to what an individual bee does, for example, that does the shaking signal. Because if you're a beekeeper, you've got higher priorities. You want your colonies to be healthy and well prepared for honey flow and things like that. You're just not in a situation to take hours and day after day watching an individual bee in a hive. So there is a certain, yeah, one is very lucky, and I've often felt extremely fortunate to have been able to basically earn my living by investigating what goes on inside a colony of bees, and teaching other students about behavior of animals, the behavior of animals. It's
Well, based on what you've just said there, I'll ask a question that I think I know the answer to, which is, how often, you know, throughout your research career, how often have you gotten insights into either what to study or what the answers to some of your questions might be? How often have you gotten insights from beekeepers? And when you do, how often is it the hobby beekeeper, and how often is it the commercial beekeeper who might have some insights to share with you? Or maybe beekeepers have never been of much use.
it was I haven't really had a lot of interactions with beekeepers except at the time of harvesting the honey when the bees when I need to I take the honey supers up to a beekeeper near Ithaca, New York, John Ryan, and have a good evening. They're spinning and extracting the honey. Um, uh, s- s- the, I've had so I haven't had a lot of interaction with professional or commercial beekeepers.
Mhm.
I do have the interactions I have with beekeepers are really, I guess I did, are really with the hobbyists, the
Mhm.
people that attend for example, the Eastern Apicultural Society summer meeting, annual meeting. Um, and those, I really value that because it gives me, it taught me starting way back at the beginning when I was doing this work that there are a lot of hobby beekeepers who are really keen to learn more um, about what the bees are actually doing. And so when I was just a graduate student, Roger Morse here at Cornell, he organized one of the EAS meetings. I think it was 1975, and he had me give a talk on bee trees and what I was learning about what the nest site scouts want in a future home site. And that was, I could see the audience was very interested in that stuff, and it it was a strong learning experience for me to see that, oh, this stuff is, these beekeepers really want it, are really are really curious about this stuff, as curious as I am, even though that's not what they're doing. They would, I, I think they're, I think a lot of beekeepers are fascinated about it because they, yeah. Wi-Fi here at Liddell died for a second.
I've already made some callous remarks about the Wi-Fi at Liddell, so I'll cut in from there, and then we can cut in from here, and we can jump right back into to our conversation here. Um,
Okay.
so so welcome back. The I guess the point you were making, and I think it's a really good one, is you had said that as a scientist you felt privileged to be able to sit and just carefully observe bees. And I think that what I found is what you were getting at, is that many hobby beekeepers also have that privilege, is that when you've got one or two hives, you can take that time to do that close observation, whereas a commercial beekeeper with 4,000 colonies is going to make a lot of honey, but they might not have the time to sit there and look really closely at the wing, or, the queen who has a funny shaped wing or something like that, and to learn what the consequences for her will be.
Oh yeah, it's a real different situation. Even if you had anything where you're working at the, where you're functioning at, where you're relating to the bees as colonies of bees, that's a whole different, sorry, let me say it better. The situation of a beekeeper, even if it's a hobbyist beekeeper with just a few hives, you're still dealing with whole colonies, and the bees are out of sight. They're inside your hives. So you can do a little bit of observing at the entrance, and that's cool. You can see the guards and watch the foragers, but you really have to. The most important tool in my investigations are is the observation hive, and the wooden stake on which you mount a swarm.
Well, that's something that I've always explained to people. They've said, oh, you went to Cornell, you did all this great research, you worked with Tom. It must have been amazing to be in the lab. And it's hard to explain to people that the lab has crummy Wi-Fi and it's basically just a couple of flasks and a few feeders and a shed full of bee equipment. That basically the way you taught me to do bee research is much like Martin Lindauer's groundbreaking work on swarms. It was him with a pen and paper and some swarms on a stick and a little stool he sat on while he observed them. It wasn't any kind of high-tech multi-million-dollar laboratory equipment. You've used that in your research when it was necessary. You had some very expensive high-speed cameras back before they were cheap and easily accessible, but much of your work has been on the cheap and pretty straightforward. It's mostly been made out of 2x4s or duct tape.
Yeah, it has, of course, its limits. You can learn a lot because it's um, with those simple approaches. But if you want to go deeper into the individual bee, understand how the bee senses these things, um, some of the mechanical details of its behavior, um, yeah, then you need to use tools that are much more sophisticated than I'm comfortable with working.
Hmm.
So I think that's one of the nice things. Different people have different skills and different approaches. Um, as long as somebody has a fascination for the bees at whatever level, the colony level, the individual, as long as they have that, they follow their curiosity, they will pick up the tools that will work for them, that will get them to their destination. At least that's what I've watched with students like yourself and others.
Well, yeah, speaking of all of the wonderful mentees that you described throughout the book, all of these great research projects, there was one mentee of yours who was conspicuously absent from the chapters, but I can forgive you that because you did talk about some of the work we did together in your other excellent recent book, The Lives of Bees, which is all about how honeybees live in the wild. And obviously, I was working with you on the wild bees out in the forest and talking about how these bees are coping with varroa. And so I do encourage folks to read both of those, both this new book and that slightly less new book. Do you think that people who liked one book will like the other? Do you think that these are really aimed at the same audience, or?
Oh, that's a very thoughtful question, David. Um, the new book, Piping Hot Bees and Boisterous Buzz Runners, is aimed for people with any kind of background, really. I think as long as you can read, you can understand that book, I think. I'm pretty sure. The Lives of Bees is more scientific. It requires more knowledge of biology. It's still very accessible, and I wrote it in a way that I wasn't writing for scientists. I was writing for beekeepers there too, but I've gotten the feedback that it's not always easy to understand those chapters.
Hmm.
They are a bit more technical, some of them, and so that uh, and they are also have a different aim. The Piping Hot Bees is just about behaviors,
Hmm.
and the Lives of Bees is about questions about domestication, how they live in the forests, population patterns of how are the wild colonies surviving, things like that. So there's some fancy genetic analyses of the wild colonies which showed that they went through a big genetic bottleneck when the
Hmm.
ver came. Yeah, so they're different, and the yeah different each book. I'd have to
Yeah.
say each book that I've written, I guess I have had a different aim in writing the book.
Hmm.
And this last one I wanted it to be as broad as possible because it is a sampling of the projects I've done. When I made a list of the chapters that I could put into this latest book, Piping Hot Bees, I came up with 39 topics, and so I only could do 20 because that's what the editor said. You can't do more than
that's
that.
that's how much book they were willing to publish.
That's right, that number of words, because I had given them sample chapters and they saw how long they were. So yeah, it's each book is a story in it. The making of it is a story in itself, and
Mhm.
it's somewhat influenced by what the publishers control.
Well, I believe it is accurate when I say that I have read all of the books that you have written. And you're right that they're very different. Some of them are very much textbooks and some of them are very much not. And I think that this one has excellent insights to a beekeeper or to a scientist, but I don't think you need to be either to still get insights and value from the way you've written these chapters.
Yeah. The other book that I think I wrote in and I think it's in a very accessible way to anybody who's interested in honeybees is Honeybee Democracy. That one
Absolutely.
that one I wrote because it's such a cool story of how the scout bees make their decision and so forth. I thought that this is of interest to any human being. The democracy isn't just a human process. So yeah, that one I'm very proud of too.
Well, Tom, I don't want to take up too much of your valuable time, but before we go, is there one particular story that, out of the 20 that you chose for this that you really think is your favorite or is sort of the most fun or might tantalize people most effectively to want to go and read the book themselves?
Oh, what an interesting question, David.
I can't pick a favorite. That's why I'm making you do it because I read it and I think that they're all fascinating.
Well, one that I think beekeepers could really easily relate to is the chapter 14, which is called Nectar Flow On, question mark. Because that's something we as beekeepers are always thinking about. Is there a nectar flow on now, or what's and that affects, how you whether you give the bees more space and things like that. So I think that's one that is accessible. And another one that I think is really uh, interesting and important to beekeepers is the chapter Colony Thirst, because I think everybody intuitively knows that bees need water.
Mhm.
It's not something that's easily seen that they're collecting water. But if you get into that chapter, you learn that these water collectors are really important and it's really well controlled. And one of the times in the annual cycle when the bees get really thirsty is the winter. If if they don't have some condensation inside their hive, they get wicked thirsty. And I
Mhm.
know that as I explained from the bees living in my observation hive, like
Mhm.
you have, right?
Right.
In my office. In winter, there's no condensation because it's a heated room and they get wicked thirsty.
Right. And I had the privilege of while you and Maddie Oswald and Michael Smith were doing some of the thirst experiments you talk about in the book in one greenhouse at the lab. I was in the next greenhouse over trying to see if a varroa mite could get onto a bumblebee. And
Oh, I remember that.
the
Yeah.
unpublished answer is they can get on, but they don't last long because the bumblebees, bite their legs right off. But
Yeah.
that was really fascinating to get to poke my head in there periodically and watch water collecting, which as a beekeeper, I knew my bees were doing it, but it's not something that you can observe until you very carefully engineer the circumstances, put them in a dry greenhouse with a little bit of moss or a little water feeder. So, I think you're right that any of these chapters would be great for beekeepers, but it offers those in particular offer insights into behavior that we know is important, but we just don't see in our day-to-day, week-to-week colony inspections. So I think that this book offers huge insights that will make beekeepers better beekeepers. Um, and that's
And
why Betterbee has your book up for sale for pre-order, and once it officially launches, it will be available for folks to order. And I couldn't more strongly encourage folks to go and get a copy of this. It's both fun reading, but it's also, I think, really there's a great deal of depth to it. It's not challenging to understand it because you're such a clear writer, but you've got real valuable insights into bee behavior that I think will make a lot of people into better beekeepers.
I think that's my hope, David. Or not my hope, but that's one thing that well, I guess I will say it. It's a hope. I think I think that anyone who reads this book will realize these bees are wicked more complicated behaviorally, way more complicated behaviorally than we knew
Mhm.
until these investigations were made. So I think you just come away with a deeper sense of the beauty of the worker honeybee. It is such an amazing insect. And as I say at the very last part of this book, it's probably the most intelligent insect. And it's just as we human beings are the most intelligent of our group in the animal kingdom. Um,
Or so we like to imagine.
well, I think there's no question.
Yeah,
There's no other species that has the ability to say, you can find food if you go over in that direction. And the
right.
honey is the only in that distance. The honeybee is the only one that can do that abstractly the way as abstractly as we do with her waggle dance.
Mhm.
So um yeah, no, I think we both probably feel very, I don't know, fortunate to have made honeybees um kind of the focus of our scientific work. So yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. Well, Tom, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. It was a great pleasure, despite the occasionally choppy internet out there at the research lab. And thank you very much for writing this book and for giving us this sort of sneak peek into some of the storytelling that you do in it.
Thank you, David. It's wonderful it's always been fun to work with you, and it's been no exception. So thank you for this opportunity, and
Great.
I wish you all the best.
See you later, Tom.
Yep. Bye bye.
Okay, hello everyone. Welcome. It is my great pleasure to welcome to the screen. Tom, stop playing with your camera. My 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 distinguished PhD mentor and colleague and good friend, Professor Tom Seeley, emeritus professor at Cornell University, and here because he is the author of a brand new and very fun book all about honeybee behavior. No, Tom, now you're sharing your screen. Stop that.
Oh, I'm sorry, David. I'm not really super
Here,
knowledgeable.
let me commandeer your control. There we go. There we are. We're
Okay.
going to leave all of this in the recording. Maybe not. We'll see. We'll see how we'll see how goofy this gets. Anyway, Tom, thank you so much. Stop. Why are you sharing your screen? Stop sharing your screen.
I'm sorry, because I was trying to see you, David, and you were hidden
Oh,
behind this.
I'd vanished. All right. I see. Well, why don't we hang on?
Oh, there you go.
There I am.
Now I see you, and it's not a disembodied voice.
Okay, good. That's far better. Although I wouldn't want to look at me for a half hour, but if you can tolerate it, then so be it. All right. Perhaps we will restart the the introduction then.